Today we have lecture number 5. With us we have Dr. Barathi Srinivasan, who is a poet, a translator, an assistant professor of English at the Srinivisa Ramanujan Center, Shastra Deemed University, Kumbakonam, which is in Kumbakonam. She is an literary enthusiast who has a lot of interest on translating poems, short stories, and novels. Her poems are anthologized in various national and international poetry anthologies. She has recently translated 2 short story collections, 5 poetry anthologies, and a novel in Tamil language. She has been awarded the Best Faculty Award and Best Translator Award 2020 by Cape Comorin Trust, which is situated in Kanyakumari. Besides this, she has also participated in and presented and chaired sessions in various conferences and seminars, and also acted as resource persons in various national and international conferences. She has published research papers in Scopus Indexed and UGC Care journals as well. Dr. Barathi ma'am, we are extremely happy and honored to have you today as our resource person. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And we all look forward for a very engaging session on the rise of Transcendentalism, which is a landmark event in the history of American literature. The platform is all yours, ma'am.
First of all, I would like to record my deep and sincere thanks and gratitude to Dr. Saikat Banerjee. It is because of you I'm here in this platform. I'm going to share my thoughts on American Transcendentalism. As a student of American literature, my specialization was in American literature. I did my PhD on confessional poetry, which is again an offshoot of Transcendentalism. So that made me to choose this particular topic. So, and I wish to state here that one day or two, couple of hours is not enough to discuss. Of course, I will try to justify myself by giving you an overall view of what Transcendentalism means and who are the people responsible for this. And I will also discuss some of the seminal works of these people. So with this, shall I begin, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Shall I start?
You can make the screen to full and you can start.
Yeah. It's a kind of very hard task because over these years, many minds have tried to define the concept of Transcendentalism. So it is basically a word which has been variously interpreted. So Charles Dickens, here I would like to quote the words of Charles Dickens, who once said, I was given to understand that whatever was unintelligible would be certainly transcendentalism. So the word transcendent means beyond as well as above. So transcendentalism is basically a belief in the existence of the divine world, which is beyond and above world. So in a sense, it also means that we perceive with our sense, which is not at all real. So the actual reality, which lies beyond our experience of sense. So this divine cannot be known by our reasoning ability, reasoning attitude, or rate analysis. It can be felt and experienced through our spirit, through especially intuition. So this intuition is a sort of direct relation with God, through which God guides the human beings continuously. So the as a God has unfolded every mystery and lessons for humans in the bosom of nature. So it is one of the best ways to awake the intuition. So basically, Transcendentalism is an offshoot of Romanticism. So here I go with my next slide with some basic definitions on Transcendentalism. So Transcendentalism is an American philosophy and a political movement, as well as a religious movement of early 19th century, which centers around one person, that is Ralph Waldo Emerson. So he can be called as the father or founder of Transcendentalism. So the word Transcendentalism is derived from the German Romantic philosophy, which may also be defined as a modified kind of Calvinism by man's natural goodness. And here are some definitions of transcendentism. So transcendentism is a very formal word, a very simple idea, what talks about people, men as well as women, equally have a knowledge about themselves and which transcends, which goes beyond what they could see, taste, touch, or feel. So American transcendentalism, so it was a kind of a high count once heard given to a young person, as quoted by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says that it was a high counsel that I once heard given to a young person: always do what you're afraid to do. So the belief that truths about life and death can be reached by going beyond or outside the world of senses. So it is a movement which arose among the liberal New England Congregationists during the 19th century by some writers and philosophers who belonged to New England, who were loosely bound to each other by the adherence to an idealistic system of thought based on a belief in the essential unity of all creation. So the innate goodness of humanity and the supremacy of insight over the logic and experience for the revelation of deeper truths and thoughts. Excuse me. So basically, these transcendentalists, they believed in the importance of efficacy of human beings, and they strive hard and they oppose to the bleaker puritanic picture, which is complete in itself, and they observe it as something which is inescapable by humans. And these people, they emphasize on the unity rather than on the Trinity. So that is why we have this term Unitarian. And let's have a look at the origin of Transcendentalism. So let me move back to the previous slide. Sorry. Just give me a moment. I think I have a far. Just give me a second. So let me go to the first slide. Next one. Sorry for the inconvenience. So when we talk about this origin of Transcendentalism, it is based on some of the Eastern philosophies too, Oriental philosophies like Zoroastrianism and other religions, and it applies the essence of them like Buddhism, then Islam, Christianity, Hinduism. So all these are amalgamated. All these thoughts are brought in Transcendentalism. So you can call this as a kind of umbrella term, which brings in all the concepts and ideas which are presented in the religions of East as well as the West. So Transcendentalism finds out that being one in the, that is the ultimate being, is the main goal for every human being, which is the basis of all religions. So humans have the capability to be pure, away from all kind of corruptions, if they remain conscious about the conscience which is very much inherent in them. So now the question is, what is American transcendentalism? So basically, American transcendentalism, it was a religious, philosophical, as well as literary and cultural movement. So it started in the eastern part of the US, which we call as Boston. So I already mentioned you that American transcendentalism is religious, philosophical, literary, as well as a cultural movement. So I will be explaining you elaborately on how it has been a religious or philosophical cultural movement. So let me give you a gist of the origin of transcendentalism. So it arose among the liberalists of New England Congregationalists who departed from the Orthodox Calvinism. So they believed in the importance of human efficacy, which is opposed to the Puritanic thoughts. And they focus much, they highlight on unity rather than on the Trinity, which you find in various religions. So why you have this term Unitarian? And Unitarianism was a flowering of Eastern Massachusetts rather than of New England. And here you have two main divisions. That is, one is the radicals and other is transcendentalists. So the radical aspects of Renaissance, they are presented in by the transcendentalist. So this transcendentalism is the name given to the intellectual attitude which was developed by a number of young men who were living in the Boston area during the 1930s. And transcendentalism has its origin especially in New England in the early 1800s, and which gave birth to Unitarianism. So it was born from a debate between New England theologians who believed that religion should focus on emotional experience. And on the other hand, you have old light opponents who valued reason in religious approach. So these old lights, which came to be known as liberal Christians, and then as we call them as Unitarians, they were defined by the belief that there was no Trinity of Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so there were various philosophies which began to whirl around this crowd and ideas, so that later became Transcendentalism, which splits from Unitarianism and is perceived to have rationality, and though it was rational, at the same time, it embraced German Romanticism in a quest for more spiritual experience. So that is how these transcendentalists are more different from the radicals. And the thinkers in this movement, they embraced ideas brought forth by philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Hegel, and poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and ancient Indian scriptures like the Vedas, and religious founder Emmanuel. He is also a great influence among the early transcendentalists. So transcendentalists, they basically advocated the idea of a personal knowledge of God, that is believing that there is no intermediary, there is no intermediate or go-between was needed for the spiritual light. So this is a basic belief of transcendentalists. So they embraced idealism, which focuses on nature, which is opposed towards materialism. So by 1830s, literature began to appear that found the transcendentalist ideas together in a cohesive way, and it marked the beginnings of a more organized way. So what does this deal with? What does this transcendentalism deal with? So it deals with the relationship between man and nature, which is heightened by the awareness of the relationship, would cause a reformation of society away from materialism as well as corruption. So it is essentially a literary movement which established a clear American voice. So Emerson first expressed his philosophy in his monumental work, Nature, his essays on nature. So there is a general belief in higher reality than which was achieved by human reasoning. And it also suggests that every individual is capable of discovering this higher truth or higher knowledge through their intuition. So this is a very essence of transcendentalism. And what does it mean? What does transcendentalism mean? So it is essentially an ideal spiritual state which transforms or transcends the physical and the empirical. So it is a loose collection of eclectic ideas about various subjects like literature, philosophy, religion, social reform, and general about the American culture and religion. So it transcendentalism has different meanings for each person who are involved in the movement. And let me put this question to you. So where does it come from? You may think Ralph Emerson was the seminal figure who brought in transcendentalism, but he gives credit to German philosopher Immanuel Kant for popularizing the term transcendentalism. But Ralph Waldo Emerson should be considered as the father of transcendentalism. So this movement began basically as a reform in the Unitarian Church. So transcendentalism is not all a religion. So more accurately, if you want to talk about it, it is a kind of philosophy or even a form of spirituality, which is centered around Boston and Concord, Massachusetts in the 1800s. So for many of the transcendentalists, the term transcendentalism represents a new confidence and appreciation of mind powers and modern and non-doctrinal spirituality. And there are various assumptions about transcendentalism. So there are four basic premises here. One is an individual is the spiritual center of the universe. It is a kind of belief. And in an individual can be found the clue to nature, history, and ultimately the cosmos itself. This is one of the four premises. And the next one is the structure of the universe that is literally duplicated the structure of the individual self. So all the knowledge begins self-knowledge. So this is the second assumption. And the third assumption is transcendentalists accepted the concept of nature as a kind of living mystery full of science, and nature is symbolic. This is the third assumption. And the final one is it is a belief that individual virtue and happiness depend on self-realization. So this depends upon the reconciliation of two universal psychological tendencies. One is the desire to embrace the whole world, and the other one is the desire to withdraw. That is, it is an egoistical existence. So actually, what prompted this movement? So there are many reasons for the rise of transcendentalism. So these are some of the reasons for the rise of transcendentalism. Like the development of cities during your industrial revolution period, and the dividing of class systems like the working class and the ruling class, and the civil war, and freedom from the past, freedom from organized religion, and the greed of human beings, and what more. So first, it was a humanistic philosophy that it put the individual right at the center of the universe and promoted respect for human capacities. So the movement was in part a reaction against increasing industrialization in the late 18th and 19th centuries, which was against the dehumanization and materialistic attitude of people. So in 1814, there was a program bill owner, Francis Cobert Lowell. He introduced powerloom into American textile industry at his Boston manufacturing company. So the New England Transcendentalists consequently grew to maturity at the time when the nature of work and the role of labor were undergoing a tremendous change before their eyes and very close to their home. Secondly, in the early 19th century, in the period preceding the rise of Transcendentalism, dissatisfaction with the spiritual inadequacy of the established religion was one of the reasons. And some early Unitarian ministers, especially William Canning, had turned away from harsh congregational Catholicism, preached a more humanistic, emotionally expressive reform of religion. So apart from Canning, there are few others among the early Unitarians who had a formative influence on the Transcendentalists. So however, even the liberal Unitarians, they remained under the sway of 17th century English philosopher John Locke, who explained knowledge as perceivable only by direct observation through physical senses. So Kant's later presentation of knowledge as intuitive was, of course, in direct opposition to what Locke has said. So in a sense, Transcendentalism could be considered as a reaction against extreme rationalism of enlightenment. So essentially, there was some dissatisfaction in religion. So people started questioning their religion as gave birth to or raised Transcendentalism. So clearly, Emerson and Parker both envisioned true religion as a personal rather than as institutional, which is a connection with divine. And there was yet another reason for the rise of Transcendentalism. So that was the increasing interest in and availability of foreign literature and philosophy after 1800s. So the Americans were traveling and studying in Europe, and some of them brought books back to America from when they returned home. So the Reverend Joseph Stevens, he traveled to Europe in 1801, and he studied biblical scholarship and European methods of biblical interpretation. And later, when he returned home, he came with some about 3,000 volumes, which he purchased from abroad. So similarly, George Ticknor in 1815, along with Edward Everett, went to Europe to study. They also traveled extensively and brought back very valuable German philosophical books to their libraries. And Emerson was significantly one of their students of Everett and Ticknor. So basically, these people have influence on Emerson. So during this period too, there were translations into English from European works, which began to make foreign thoughts freely available to the Americans. At the same time, there were many in England and America who were exposed to the German thoughts and literature through the writings of Coleridge and Carlyle. So Coleridge's work, Aids to Reflection, which was first published in 1825, which was later edited 1829 by James Marsh with a elaborate introduction elucidating German philosophy for American readers. So Carlyle wrote a life of Schiller, which was translated from Goethe. So between 1838 and 1842, George Ripley edited and published 14 volumes. So it is a set titled Specimens of Foreign Standard Literature, so which included translations of French and German writings. So naturally, all these influenced the Americans who were exposed to foreign culture and foreign thoughts for the first time. And this prompted the rise of the movement. And we have in 1840, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody who opened a circulatory library and bookstore on West Street in Boston to supply her comrades with foreign works. So there were a lot of people who were involved in this movement. So let us have a look at these people. Who are these transcendentalists? So transcendentalist is a person who accepts these ideas not as religious beliefs, but as a way of understanding the relationship in life. So among the many foreign authors who influenced the transcendentalists were the Germans like Immanuel Kant, Fichte, Schelmer, Hegel, Schelling, Goethe, and there were writers like Coleridge, Carlyle, Wordsworth, Plato, and Neoplatonic English writers, and Swedish mystic Immanuel, and the Eastern writings of Confucius, and the sacred text of Vishnu Purana, the Vedas, Vedanta, and Bhagavad Gita. So all these influenced a certain group of people who lived in the US, and they accepted the ideas. They didn't consider that as a religion, but they just drew the ideas from Eastern as well as Western philosophies. And what do these transcendentalists believe? So transcendentalists, as Emerson notes, believes in miracles, which is conceived as the perpetual openness of human mind to new influx of light and power. And as you could see, that everything in this world, including people, are a reflection of God or divine soul, superior soul. So the physical world is a kind of doorway to the spiritual world. Only through physical you can move towards the spiritual. So people can always use their intuition to seek God in nature and even in their own souls. So a person is his or her own best authority. Here the transcendentalists believe in two important aspects. One is intuition and another one is feeling. So I think that feeling and intuition are superior to reason and intellect. Now let us have a look at the historical development of transcendentalism. So there were a small group of intellectual thinkers, writers, as well as social activists, of whom most of them were Unitarians. And within a short span of time, means from 1830 to 1850s, they were able to influence across a variety of fields, across a range of fields. So basically, they were based in Concord and Boston. And these thinkers and writers, they have attended Harvard University or the Divinity School, where they have been trained in to become an Unitarian. So sometimes these people could be seen as the first people to spread counterculture in America. And it is this transcendentalism give rise to the Transcendental Club. So the Transcendentalist Club is referred to as a club with like-minded people, because no two figures thought or alike. And liberty is the hallmark of this movement. And it is critical of current thinking as well as norms. So here, the people found something new and refreshing in idealistic philosophy, specifically the German philosophy, the club of like-minded. So on September 12, 1836, 4 of the Harvard alumni, writers, and Unitarian ministers such as George Livy, George Putnam, they joined together for the purpose to follow up on the correspondence between Hodge and Emerson to talk about the state of Unitarianism. And it is for this purpose they started this Transcendentalism and Transcendental Club. So this was a kind of group where they held meetings, weekly meetings, which included participants like Unitarian ministers, intellectuals, writers, and reformers. So there would be 30 more meetings, which would be called as the Transcendental Club over the next 4 years. So featuring members like Emerson, Ripley, and Hodge. So the only rule in these meetings was that no one would be allowed to attend it if their presence prevented the group from discussing a topic. So that was the unwritten rule of the club. So Emerson's essay, Nature, which was published in 1836, it was presented in the Transcendental Club, and it has formed during these club meetings. So this group stopped to meet in 1840, but later it gave birth to the publication of the Dial. So at first helmed by the member and pioneering feminist Margaret Fuller, and later by Emerson, with the mission of addressing transcendentalist thoughts and concerns. So the Dial, it was a journal which was started by the Transcendental Club, which was founded in 1840. So they wanted a platform to bring out their ideas to the general public. So, but since they were having a hard time getting their essays and articles published in conventional periodicals, so they decided to start up a journal on their own. So that is how there came this Dial. So the Dial also lasted only for 4 years, from 1840 to 1844. And it was renewed later, but we are talking about the basics here. And that was because the Transcendentalists did not find as many subscribers as they have hoped. So this happens even today. And the journal did not exactly bring in the big bucks. So that is the reason for dropping the journal. And let us now have a look at movement potential characteristics. So transcendentalists, they believed that souls can understand truth through intuition. So that is, we don't arrive at truth by just donning a lab coat or putting on goggles and conducting an experiment in a lab. Well, okay. So maybe we can arrive at some kind of scientific truths that way. But that's not what transcendentalists were out for. They believe that there is a whole realm of experience. So that is beyond logical or rational deduction. And uh, according to these transcendentalists, the only way to access the realm of experience and knowledge is the trust in our intuition. So our inner voice, or otherwise our inner gut. So we may not have any proof that God do exist, for example, but we may feel that he or she or they does so, right? So in self-reliance, Emerson tells us to trust on our own instincts and thoughts. And here I would like to quote a line from Emerson's Self-Reliance. He says that no reason can be asked or given why the soul seeks beauty. Beauty in its largest and profoundest sense is one expression for the universe. So God is all fair, truth and goodness and beauty are but different phases of same all. So from this, these transcendentalists, they want us to rely on our intuition. And even in nature, he talks about this. Then what makes a nation's pillars high and its foundation strong? So what makes it mighty to defy force that round and form? So it is not gold, it is not kingdom's brand, go down the battle shop, but instead men who for truth and honor's sake stand fast and suffer along. So this is what he states in nature. And Unitarianism was the main religious movement in New England at the time. Transcendentalism began spreading in the region in 1820s and 30s. So remember, Unitarianism is the liberal church of Christianity, which emphasizes reason and the importance of rational thought and intellect in distinguishing between the right and wrong and good and the evil. So this is the timeline of transcendentalism. So it starts with Waldo Emerson, who gives his Unitarian ministry a grade, and then you have the big because of the club, thanks to the club, Emerson publishes Nature. It gives way to the beginning of a journal, the diaries by transcendentalists, because they cannot get published in the real world. Then comes Margaret Fuller, a feminist at first hand, with a publication on women in the 19th century. Then Thoreau with his civil disobedience, and in 1854 he publishes his Walden, and with some more people like Walt Whitman with his Leaves of Grass. So transcendentalists, they raise up to their level. And Walt Whitman cranks out his first edition of Leaves of Grass and the Canons on the Horizon. They start seeding in droves, and the Civil War gets its start. Let me move on to the next slide. So as I was talking about qualities of transcendentalism, they talk about nature, and they talk about individualism and moral enthusiasm, right? So let us have a look into each one of these aspects. So transcendentalists, they look at nature as something divine. So nature is life. So to communicate and be one with nature was true goodness. So nature was innocence and an escape from evils in the society. And those transcendentalists, they sure loved long walks on the woods, sniffing the flowers. They really loved nature. And they also that industrialization, which was sweeping through the country at the time when they start writing. Industrialization was the main reason why they wanted to look back at nature. And the transcendentalists, they believe that nature gives us access to God. And nature's power, in other words, reflects God's power. So whether you are in it for God or for streaking just through the meadows, transcendentalism can show you where it is at. Then let's move on to individualism. So individualism, it talks about the rejection of standard societal beliefs. The inner truth is the only thing which matters, and the soul is something which is equally available to everyone, irrespective of caste, creed, gender, religion, etc. And it talks about the fulfillment which comes from knowing oneself. It is not wealth or gender or education. So individualism is really an important idea and a way of life for the transcendentalists. They believe that it is a big reason for people to feel happy or either dissatisfied when they try too hard to come. So transcendentalists insisted that we needed to ditch all those societal pressures, social norms that make us want to conform. So we need to follow our own, we need to be individualistic. So that is what he states, Emerson states in his Self-Reliance. And while talking about this moral enthusiasm, this also in a way promoted the transcendentalist, because the transcendentalists wanted to put an end to the aristocracy and they wanted to bring in democracy. Anti-aristocracy is equal to democracy. And we all know that slave trade did existed during the early 19th century, and many slaves were brought through Brazil and other parts to America and western part of Europe. So these people, these transcendentalists, they resisted this slave movement. And we have Margaret Fuller, who supported women's rights. And in book form, it talks about a utopian idea, a quest for nature, living one with nature, and just like what Wordsworth has told. And these are some of the key concepts you find in transcendentalism. So it predominantly promotes a new understanding of individuals and their relationship with nature and society. So basically, it gives importance to self-development, self-knowledge. So these are the essential factors which transcendentalism. So they wanted to promote a new kind of understanding of individuals and their relation with nature and society. And much importance is given to self-development and self-knowledge, which are the key factors that leads towards education. And it considers individual as a source of knowledge. And moreover, it highlights on self-reliance, and it considers nature and physical world both as meaningful. So altogether, put together, these talk about an optimistic provide for education, labor rights, women's rights, and abolition of slavery. And it is predominantly concerned with the commitment of individual freedom, development as a social progress. And this movement helped to shape the issues and focus on reforming these issues. And these are some of the major. So shall I continue?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, sorry for the inconvenience, listeners. So talking about the major beliefs, what these transcendentalists believe is that everything in this world is a reflection of God or the divine soul, and the physical world is just a doorway to the spiritual world. So people can use their intuition to see God and nature in their own souls. So basically, they highlight two things. One is feeling, and another one is intuition. These two things are considered as something superior to reason as well as intellect. So this transcendental movement is rooted on religion, philosophy, literature, as well as culture. So we can find the roots of transcendentalism in idealism of Greece, which started around the 4th century BC, and Puritanism in North America during the early 17th century, and also Romanticism in the mid 19th century of Europe and North America. And finally, you have a full-formed Transcendentalism in North America during the early 19th century. And let me move on to the next slide. So these are some of the terms which are connected with your transcendentalism. So these people, they are very much indulged in the issues of the society, like abolitionism, that is anti-slavery movement, for example, and antinomianism, against not exactly against religion, but questioning the ideas presented in religion, the complications present in the religion, and utilitarianism. So these are some of the important terms involved in this transcendentalism, which we will be looking at the later part of it. And talking about the social and political context, these transcendentalists, they started to believe that the society around them, the people around them, were seriously deficient. They considered them as a mass or bugs or spawn, as Emerson puts it down in his American Scholar. So the slave drivers of themselves, as Thoreau says in the Walden. And in the mid-century, 19th century, transcendentalists expressed their dissatisfaction with their society, which became focused on the policies and actions of the government of the US. And Margaret Fuller, she addresses slavery directly in her work, Woman in the 19th Century, the choice of the people, where she writes, so I quote her words, threatens to rivet the chains of slavery and the leprosy of sin permanently on this nation with the annexation of Texas. So she angrily questions, you see the men, how they are willing to sell shamelessly the happiness of countless generations of fellow creatures. So basically, she's talking about the slave trade which existed in United States and other parts of the West. And she wanted to abolish this slave trade, apart from supporting women's rights. So this called both the individual and the individuals acting together, which categorize Thoreau's Resignation, wherein Thoreau concludes, he says that I cannot, for an instant, recognize the political organization as my garment, which is the slave's garment also. So we have major transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau. And apart from that, you have major founders and seminal figures like Bronson Alcott, George Ripley, Brownson, Elizabeth Peabody, Henry Hedge, and Theodore Parker, as well as Margaret Fuller, and poets like Ellen Sturgis Hopper, John Swery, William Ellery Canning, and Christopher Pierce. So he is a music critic, and John Sullivan White. So these were transcendental poets who were associated with the movement. And these are some of the works of Emerson, like Nature, the Poets, Circles, and Divinity School Address is an address in the form of an essay, and you have Letter to the Second Church and Society. So these are parts of essays which were published later. And also he has published poetry apart from essays and prose. So when we look at the history of Emerson, Emerson read this at a lecture at the Boston in January 1842. It was first published in Nature, Address and Lectures in 1849. So what is popularly called transcendentalism among people is the idealism as it appears in 1842. So here Emerson talks about the idealist, materialist, and transcendentalist in his work, The Transcendentalist. So he explains who a transcendentalist is. So from the 1840s to 1880s in Concord, Massachusetts, there we have Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau. And these people, though they were deprived of their school teaching career, he has provided people with a vast knowledge. And even Amos Bronson Alcott, in his masterpiece, Orphic Sayings, which was published in the Dial, he was a typical person who has taken tremendous efforts, but it was most misunderstood. Even today, there were many people who are unaware of the life and legacy of this brilliant transcendentalist, Amos Bronson Alcott, who is the father of Lucia May Alcott. And he is also one of the members of Transcendentalist Society. And currently, when one thinks of American transcendentalism, so the first persons to come to our mind are invariably Emerson and Thoreau. So there were numerous other transcendentalists, and as significant as these two people are, so they represent only a part of this rich and varied movement. So notably, Alcott acquired many epithets from his admirers. So he was dubbed an American saint by one of the author, and someone else calls him as the American Socrates. So he was also known as American Orpheus. So in 1856, the prominent Unitarian leader, Henry Bellows, called Alcott the father of transcendentalism and a Plato of our time. So one historian named him as New England Saint. So you have Alcott's descendant, Dorothy Bronson Baker. So she called him as a Christ with a family, and she founded a Bronson Alcott Society in 1879 to reintroduce his remarkable works. And Emerson, in his work, Nature, he talks about, he lays attempts to solve an abstract problem, that is, humans do not fully accept nature. And his essay basically consists of 8 sections, like nature, beauty, language, discipline, idealism, spirit, and so on. So each section adopts a different perspective on the relation between humans and nature and uses spirituality as a major theme. And we all know that Emerson is truly the center of American transcendental movement, setting out most of the ideas and values in his book Nature. So his book Nature was published in 1836, which represented his last 10 years of intense study in philosophy, religion, and literature. So Emerson's house was always a busy one, excuse me, with his friends like Elizabeth Hoare, Margaret Fuller, and Thoreau staying for months together out and talk. So he, Bronston Alcott, and George Ripley, they decided on to begin the magazine The Dial with Margaret Fuller as the editor. So it is where Emerson produced his ideas and thoughts on nature. And Emerson argues that we need to learn to be a lot individualistic about freeing ourselves from the fetters of social convention and the opinion of others. So only by following our own individual path and our own inner instinct, we will be able to distinguish truth from falsehood and good from evil. And he adds a bonus. We will be much happier for it. So Emerson's essays, they exemplify the transcendentalist virtue of individualism. So they really believe that people should think for themselves. And he presents this idea in Self-Reliance, which shows us exactly why that is so important. So talking about nature, in this, Emerson talks about the power of nature. So nature can actually lead us to God and to our true selves. So Emerson's essay was highly influential, not to mention it was also controversial. So when it was first published, so much so that it became one of the founding documents of the club, Transcendental Club, that same year. So the essay had a huge influence on Thoreau, who read it as an undergraduate. And that is how the Transcendentalist tree began to grow. So in Self-Reliance, Emerson advises to trust ourselves. So after all, it is only a way to achieve self-reliance. So moving on to nature, where Emerson argues that everything is connected. So beauty is even, he says that one of the expression of the universe. And Emerson reads this as a lecture at the Masonic Temple in Boston in 1842. It was first published in Nature, Addresses and Lectures in 1849. So what is popularly called transcendentalism among us is actually idealism. So this idealism as it appears in 1842, which is idealist, materialist, and transcendental. So Emerson lays out to solve an abstract problem that humans do not fully accept nature's beauty. So each section adapts a different perspective on the relationship between humans and nature. They use spirituality as a major theme in the introduction to nature. So Emerson argues that people of his era moved beyond retrospection and created their own views of world around them instead. So for this reason, he advocates for re-evaluation of human beings to interact with nature. particularly the relationship between the nature and the soul. So, as Emerson sees it, people's natural surroundings cannot meet their material needs, but also help them realize nature's aesthetic value, actual spiritual growth. They can think more clearly and act with self discipline. So, Emerson labels these users as nature as commodity, beauty, language, and so on. Then in self-reliance, I have just put in the gist of self-reliance. That is, trust thyself, resist conformity, and divine providence. So these are the three important points which Emerson makes in self-reliance. So he introduces the text. He introduces the text of self-reliance with a quote, "Nete quaeris extra." So, which means do not seek outside yourself. You should seek within. You should live within. So, Emerson includes three epigraphs. So, one which translates as do not seek things outside of yourself. Another from a poem of Beaumont and Fletcher, which emphasizes person's fate is not determined by the stars. And the third, it praises power and speed of a child raised in the wilds of nature. So Emerson first moves in this essay to convince the reader that respecting intuition as a source of knowledge can yield a great enlightenment. So then looking into other sources of the individual. So he was actually making several provocative claims like individual perception of art or literature are more important than actual works that occasion them. And ordinary intuitions are more important than those respected sources of knowledge. So that is why he says, trust thyself, trust yourself. Then these 2 points, they reflect the respect that transcendentalists have for individuals and Emerson's rejection of conventionality. So Emerson's next move is to identify a problem by representing every man, his ideal reader who feels stifled by the societal expectations. And while Emerson does not formally organize this self-reliance into 3 sections. So the 3 sections in self-reliance are the value and barriers to self-reliance. You can find this in paragraph 1 to 17, and self-reliance and individual, that is from paragraph 18 to 32, and then self-reliance and society. So which talks about the various barriers to self-reliance. So Emerson opens his essay with the assertion to believe in your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men. That is genius. So his statement captures the essence of what means by self-reliance. That is relying upon oneself, depending upon your own thoughts and ideas. So he argues that individuals like Moses, Plato, and Milton are held in the highest regard because they spoke what they thought and they did not rely on the words of others or books or tradition. But unfortunately, few people today do so. Instead, he dismisses without notice his thought because it is his, right? And to be a self-reliant individual, one must return to the neutrality of youth and be a non-conformist. So for a non-conformist, here again I quote the words of Emerson, no law can be sacred to me, but that of my nature. So Emerson, he does not advocate non-conformity for the sake of rebellion, but rather so for the world may know for who you are. And so you may focus your time and efforts on reinforcing your character in your own terms. So, however, the valorization of conformity by society is not only the barrier in self-reliance. So, according to Emerson, there is yet another barrier, which is the fear of our own consistency. So, here again, I quote his words. So, a reverence for our past act or word because the eyes of others, but not other data for computing or orbit that are past acts, and we are loath to disappoint them. So rather than act with a false consistency to a past memory, we must always live in the present. And in the next section, Emerson expounds on how individuals achieve self-reliance. So as I mentioned earlier, to live self-reliantly with genuine thought and action, one must trust thyself. So in other words, one must trust the nature and the power of our inherent capacity for independence. So Emerson calls it as spontaneity or instinct. So which is the essence of genius, of the virtue and of life. And he also talks about man who is no longer upright. But instead, he quotes some saints or sage. So he is ashamed before the blade of grass or blowing bush, which means the person lacks confidence. So Emerson wants us to live in the presence with nature and God. So one must not worry about the past or the future. So one should compare oneself to others or rely on the words of others, but not one's own. So this is the deficiency which he observes. And he talks about self-reliance and society in the concluding paragraphs of self-reliance, where he argues that self-reliance must be applied to all aspects of life. And it illustrates how such an application would benefit the society. So it is easy to see that a greater self-reliance must work a revolution in all the offices and relations of men, in their religion, in their education, in their pursuits, and so on. So in regard to religion, Emerson believes that a lack of self-reliance has led prayers to become a disease of the will, disease of the intellect. So people pray to an external source from some foreign addition to their life, whereby prayer acts as a means to a private end. So Emerson also believes at the same time, true prayer involves an avoidance of regret and discontent, which indicate a personal infirmity of will, so as well as a sympathy for the suffering of others, which prolongs their own infirmity. So in regard to education, Emerson asserts that education system fosters a kind of restless mind, which causes people to travel away from themselves in hope of finding something which is greater than what they actually have. So finally, Emerson addresses the spirit of society. So according to Emerson, spirit never advances. So civilization has not led to the improvement of society, because with the acquisition of new arts and technologies comes a loss of old instincts. For example, the civilized man has built a coach, but has lost the use of his feet. So and so on. So Emerson finally concludes that nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles. So, in his American Scholar, so the scholar of the first age, so this is an expert which I have placed from the American Scholar. So originally it was titled as an oration delivered before the Pi Beta Kappa Society at Cambridge, Massachusetts in August 31, 1837. So Emerson delivered what is now referred to as the American scholar. So this essay was a speech which he delivered at Harvard. So at that time, women were barred from higher education, and scholarship was reserved exclusively for men. So Emerson published the speech under the original title as a pamphlet. So later on the same year, he published it, where he produced his views, placed his views on man thinking and oration and nature addresses and lectures, which was published in 1849. So these texts begin with introduction in which Emerson explains that his intent is to explore the scholar, or his main idea is to uh, influence the past and books and influence of action on education of the thinking man. So in the last section, he concludes by considering the duties of the scholar and then discusses his views of America in his own time. So this is what is presented in this slide. And, uh, uh, and definitely Emerson's ideas have a place in American thought. So Emerson ideas, especially those you find in self-reliance, they have an enormous impact on American thought. He has influenced the American ideals of hard work, uncompromising individualism, non-conformity, and honesty. So in his essay, Self-Reliance, he states, here I quote his words, "A great man is coming to eat at my house. I do not wish to please him. I wish that he should wish to please me." So Emerson's writings, they become a part of fabric of America's cultural consciousness. So it influenced a new generation of students, writers, artists, as well as politicians. And let us move on to the other great figure of transcendentalism, Thoreau. He was a school teacher, essayist, as well as a poet. He was very much famous for his noteworthy work, Walden, as well as civil disobedience. So he influenced environmental movement, as well as he supported abolitionism. And this is an expert from Thoreau's Walden. So Walden, the original title is Life in the Woods, which is a series of 18 essays by Thoreau in 1854. So it is an important contribution to the New England Transcendentalism. So the book was a record of Thoreau's experiment in simple living on the northern shore of Walden Pond in eastern Massachusetts during 1845 to 1847. So the book chronicles Thoreau's experience living alone in a cabin in woods of Massachusetts near a pond of the same name. So ironically, the pond is now a big tourist attraction for folks visiting Massachusetts, with pretty much exactly the sort of consumerism, conformity, and nature disrespect. So Thoreau would have hated. The book reflects many of key transcendentalist themes, including the importance of individualism, then the necessity of maintaining a connection with nature, as well as spirituality. So Walden viewed not only as a philosophical treatise, it is a leisure, it is a self-reliance, and it is also an individualism. And it also has an influence on nature writing. So it is considered as one of the magnum opus works of Thoreau. So Walden is a product of 2 years of living in a semi-isolation by Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts. So he built a small cabin on a land owned by his friend Emerson and was almost totally self-sufficient, self-reliant, growing his own vegetables and oats. And it was his intention at the Walden Pond to live simply and have went to the woods because he wished to live deliberately to front only essential facts of life. So the result was a series of essays or meditations, beginning with economy, in which he discussed his experiment and included a detailed account of the construction of his cabin. So Thoreau extolled the benefits of literature in reading through his essay. So the book implores the reader to live mindfully, that is, being forever on alert, and also solitude, which is praising the friendliness of nature, which made the fancies advances of uh, human neighborhood insignificant. So there were some later essays which are included in Walden, like visitors, higher laws, winter animals, and spring. So this is the essence of Thoreau's Walden. So that is a life in solitude doesn't need to be lonely. And secondly, even a simple life can be challenging and rewarding. And the next point is fulfillment doesn't cost a thing to us. So there are various lessons which we learn from Thoreau's Walden. Lesson number one is if you mostly keep to yourself, you won't automatically end up lonely. So then the second point which he wants to make in Walden is life doesn't need to be complicated to be challenging and rewarding. So there is no need to artificially try and construct something. And he further states that true fulfillment doesn't cost a dime because seeking truth and thinking deeply, they are always available to us. Uh, just like the winter made Thoreau's life harder, spring brought about a transformative experience of natural wonders. So, sitting on his chair, he had to watch the ice melt, the lake refill, the grass turn green, and the animals awake from their slumber. So, it was the ultimate revitalization before he returned to the city and started his next chapter. But his biggest lesson remains in his quote. So here I would like to quote from Walden: rather than love, than money, than fame, give me the truth. So this is the ultimate summary of the lesson. So in Walden, Thoreau challenges us to question common sense and to find a deeper, more intuitive sense of knowledge. So here you can divide Walden into major ideas presented on man and world, society, consciousness, and existence, where most men, according to Thoreau, are trapped in a kind of living death that surpasses everything that is natural and wonderful about human beings. And talking about society and class, Thoreau frequently compares American society to what were then considered primitive or savage societies, such as the Native Americans. So Thoreau also juxtaposes our society with ancient societies such as Greece or the Chinese. So in both these comparisons, American society often loses. So instead of becoming a more just society, Thoreau sees everywhere around him a barbaric attachment to wealth as well as political power. So we are still savages, according to Thoreau. And worse, we haven't even maintained the best customs, so-called the savage societies. So here he argues that the project of civilization remains incomplete as long as materialism, intolerance, and injustice prevail. So Thoreau's allusions to ancient philosophical texts reveal their relevance to modern American society. And Thoreau is far wiser when he set out on his experiment. The ending of Walden seems to confirm Thoreau's instinct that led them to Walden Pond in the first place. So he ends the book just as a critical study of society and individualistic as he was in the beginning. So here you have essential components of wisdom, isolation, happiness, and Thoreau is right because modern life is uh, the primary cause of unhappiness in America. At the same time, I can say that Thoreau is wrong. Most people in the world are not unhappy. But Thoreau discovers true happiness in the simple life he led at the Walden Pond. So this is another important book. I just want to give you a overview of this essay, where I lived and what I lived for. So here he talks about the connection of his soul with God, the purpose of living. So all these times and places and occasions are now and here. So God himself culminates in present moment and will never be more divine in the lapse of all ages. And we are enabled to apprehend at all with what is sublime and noble only by the perpetual instilling and wrenching of reality. So he reinforces on realism, which is around us. Again, in civil disobedience, he talks about being passive, non-violent, resisting the governmental policies to which an individual is morally opposed. And he was also influenced by great thinkers like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, and our own Mahatma Gandhi. And Bronson, Amos Bronson Alcott, he was another influential figure of Transcendentalism, as I discussed in the beginning. He was a teacher and writer, as well as a founder of Temple School and Fruitlands. He is the one who introduced art, music, nature study, and banished corporal punishment in the US. And he is the father of novelist Lucia May Alcott. And Amos Bronson was singular among the transcendentalists in his unaccessible optimism and the extent of his self-education. So he, in his Orphic saying, in his work Orphic Sayings, which was published in the Dial, he talks about people have the soul and the oversoul, which are also a subject of discussion in Emerson's poetry. And moving on to the next slide. So you have other great thinkers who talk about, who appreciate Bronson. So these are the words of Thoreau as well as Emerson on Bronson. And if we move on to the next seminal figure, there is Margaret Fuller. She was a journalist, critic, as well as a women's rights activist. And she was the first editor of the journal Dial, a transcendental journal. So she was a female journalist who worked for the New York Tribune. And she was taught at Alcott's Temple School. And Margaret Fuller, she was also considered as a mystic. And her theory of mutual dependence also applies to race relations. And her major noteworthy work is Women in the 19th Century, which was published in 1845. It is a political and philosophical treatise which gives voice to women in history, and it also envisions a new way of thinking about women's place within the society. So, like Thoreau and Emerson, she also actively opposed slavery. So, in addition to talking about slavery, she also talked about the subjugation of women, which is another kind of slavery. And moving on to the next slide. So, um, the context of transcendentalism is uh, under three sections, that is religious, philosophical, as well as national. Then you can find a literary focus on transcendentalism too. For example, here I brought Stephen's poem Sunday Morning, which brilliantly captures the three main ideas of transcendentalism, that God of the established churches is no more, and historical God who can no longer inspire faith, that religious ecstasy is to be found through contact with nature. So essentially, these people, they believe in God, they trust in God, but they don't trust in the religious scriptures. They have lost the faith. They have started questioning, right? So that is how it gave rise to Unitarian Church. And then they look back at nature. So they look at nature as a kind of religion. So nature which transcends everything, nature which brings them close to God, and that living God can be found only within oneself, within their soul. And these are the comments given by critics like Mayer, who talks about mind as a mind cure as a conventionalized lyric, and transcendentalism into a prosy pragmatism. And James, he views it as the heart of mind cure, which is its psychology. And the heart of that psychology was the displacement of consciousness, or the consciousness which could not be trusted. So we also have a critic on Locke's empirism. So where he talks about the innate ideas, you cannot find any innate ideas in transcendentalism. And he complains that though there are some ideas which are presented in transcendentalism, they are not innate. And then he elaborates on simple as well as complex ideas and the qualities, primary and secondary qualities in it, and the natural rights of people and the revolution. So let us have a quick look at the lasting impact of transcendentalism. So Emerson's Nature as well as Thoreau's Walden are still widely read by us. And the importance of these thinkers, they lie in the endurance of their major writings as American classics, which are worth reading in any period, and in their influence upon the later writers, American as well as foreign writers. And they stand as a powerful inspiration. And their reforming efforts have provided the social movements, notably the impetus given to Mahatma Gandhi and to the American civil rights movement of 1960s by Thoreau's nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. And these people, they look at nature as well as the soul. So Emerson's transcendentalist philosophy all originates from and expand in God, God as self, with growth towards the betterment through the interaction of all parts that is created. So God is the deep silent ground of total existence. And over soul, it talks about the existence of nature of the human soul, the relationship between the soul and the person and their ego, and the relationship of human soul to another human soul, and the relationship of human soul to that of God. So, in conclusion, so never truly this transcendentalism was organized body of thought, though it was characterized by certain deficiencies as well as inspirational ideas on the other hand. So transcendentalism has become one of the most subtly influential trends in the 19th century America. So with this, I conclude my lecture. And these are the references I made. And this book will be more useful if you are learning American literature. So this book by Philip Thoreau on American Transcendentalism, it will give you more insights into it. And I thank every one of you for the opportunity provided. If you have any questions, you can ask me.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
For such a descriptive, elaborative session on transcendentalism. Although we all have gone through transcendentalism, but
yes,
yet today we have surely understood that how broad and vast the area is. So thank you for very much for enlightening us on this particular
you're most welcome.
On this particular field, on this particular important topic in the field of American literature. And we thoroughly enjoyed it. And there are a few questions.
Sure.
I will put forward few questions if you permit.
Yes, sir.
On behalf of the participants.
Sure, sir.
The first question comes from. Yes, the first question is transcendentalist approach is aimed at balancing human development with scientific development rather than antithetical.
Yes, exactly. It is not.
What is your opinion?
Yeah, I do second your thoughts. So it is balancing both. It is not antithetical. Actually, it is not against any kind of religion. So if you kindly note that they are just questioning some kind of beliefs which are in the religion. So they are not drifting apart from religion. They want to get their souls connected with nature because they identify only through nature they can connect with God. So they have this idea. They brought out this idea from all the philosophies. So it is an amalgam of not only the Western philosophy, we have the Vedanta philosophy of the East. They have read widely the philosophies of East, like Oriental philosophies, Vedanta, our own Bhagavad Gita, then Buddhism, Buddhist philosophies. So after learning, after having this vast knowledge, they want to have an overall comprehensive view. So I do support what you have said. Yes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is, how does Walt Whitman's Song of Myself exemplify transcendentalism and being uniquely American in the quote?
Yeah, exactly. See, I love this question. I have to appreciate the person who have asked this question.
Malay Ranjan Behra.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir, for asking such a nice question. See, actually, as I told you, first, transcendentalism is an offshoot of romanticism. So this transcendentalism is also getting diluted, right? So we are giving more importance to self and soul, and that is through our self we can reach God. So that is the ultimate aim of transcend. Transcend means moving beyond. So going beyond the borders, moving across. So from here, there are certain group of people, we call them as confessionalists. So they want to open up their heart, threadbare to the outside world, because probably they face some psychological issues. They want to open up their mind so that they can get connected with the people or with the oversoul. So Whitman's leaves of grass, and the work which we have been talking about. So all these, they talk about Song of Myself. He talks about his own personal experiences. So the hardships which he has faced, the good and bad things which he has faced in his life. So this was the first time in American history, probably in the history of literature, people started opening up about themselves. So that was the effect of Transcendentalism. So from Transcendentalism, again, we are moving towards confessionalism. So he is like, a kind of bridge between Transcendentalism and confessionalism.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
The next question is Hawthorne and Poe both are they somehow against this idea of transcendentalism?
Actually, when you read Poe's philosophy of composition and Poe's The Raven, you get some ideas. These people also base their ideas on our East and Oriental thoughts, so which somewhere overlaps with Transcendentalism, but not exactly Transcendentalism. So that is where they stand apart. Though they are very much influenced. They are not different from these Transcendentalists, but they have their own influences. But at the same time, they are individualistic in their thoughts and opinion. So that is where these people differ from our Transcendentalists. So that is why I have not included them over there.
We take the last question of the day, and the other questions we will mail you, ma'am. You answer at your ease. We try to include that in the book chapter.
Definitely, it will be my pleasure.
Thoreau's imprisonment for not paying poll tax for 6 years, and his protest strongly staying in the Walden in order to prove his support for slaves to vote equally like others. His noble thoughts are not so popular as Martin Luther King Jr.'s address to the blacks, "I have a dream." Could you explain why is it so and why it happened?
Exactly, because politicians are everywhere the same, and it was at that time, North and Southerners, they drifted apart, and in one side you have Abraham Lincoln, who was supporting this anti-slavery movement, and these transcendentalists were also a part of it. But the problem is the people, the politicians in that Boston area, they do not support them because they wanted this slave trade where they can get benefited actually. So they were much benefited through the slave trade and other things. So that is why they are much against these ideas of those transcendentalists and other social reformers. So that is why during his period of time, during Thoreau's period, he was, you can say, kind of not recognized, but still we are reading it as a part of our literature. Not only here, throughout the world we are reading it, and he has influenced our own Mahatma Gandhi to start his movement here in India. So you can say that he was popular, but no writer was popular during their period. Only after posthumously when someone publishes it. For example, you take Emily Dickinson. She never published anything when she was alive. So only after her death, everything became open and famous. So there are writers like that.
Thank you, ma'am. With that, we come to the conclusion of this really engaging lecture on transcendentalism, which is a very important topic in the history of American literature.
Sure, sir.
It was an honor, and it was a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for such an engaging.
Thank you so much.
Our participants,
it was also a pleasurable moment for me. Yes.
Our participants also loved your session, although there was some technical glitches.
Exactly. Yeah.
but they will, they have thoroughly enjoyed the session.
Thank you so much.
What they said was, in some of the messages, they are so
Okay.
so into this session that small
Wow.
kind of technical glitches caused a lot of disturbance for them, because they were enjoying your session, and this session
thank
was
you
so
much.
highly insightful and so highly explanatory on a topic that
actually I wanted to make it more elaborate. After seeing the time, I have cut short some of my lectures. I have to.
we would love to have you. We would love to have you to in the future lecture series as well on our platform.
Probably. I will always extend my support.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And just for the information of the participants, tomorrow, Dr. Emma Zhang from Hong Kong Baptist University will be speaking on realism, and she'll be covering the period between 1865 to 1900. Kindly join on time, as usual you all do, and we will start sharp at 6. And ma'am, if you have time, please join us. We will look forward to Dr. Emma's lecture, which almost every time Dr. Emma comes to our platform, it is always a pleasure to have her, and like you. And Dr. Emma, her lectures are very engaging. So please make sure you all come. She is presently, she is such a sincere presenter that she has been in this lecture of yours throughout, right from the beginning.
Wow, thank you so much.
In order to follow how are you presenting, what is your style of, she's very inquisitive. I know her for some time now, and she's a very good friend of mine. So we meet tomorrow, and Dr. Emma will be with us from Hong Kong. Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care. Good night.
Sir, I want to tell the students one thing for the benefit of the students. I have a book with me. This will help the students who study American literature especially. So this is American literature of the 19th century. This book, where you have all the original materials, all the original American scholars, self-reliance, and Thoreau's work, Hawthorne's work, poems, everything is covered, which is edited by Fisher Samuelson and Reniger Wade. Fisher Samuelson. So if possible, they can go and have a look at this book.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much for sharing. These kind of inputs really help our scholars.
Always welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for your cooperative approach. It was a pleasure and honor to have you. Take care. Good night. Good night, participants.
Yes, happy weekend to you, sir. Happy weekend and happy Easter to all the participants. Yes, sir. Thank you.